Now, Evolution MX has an addition within it called the Invoice Register, specifically for purchasing and subcontractors. It exists within the Evolution MX framework. We're not talking MX generally today. We're going to look specifically at the Invoice Register. Those of you who are not familiar with it, we're happy to entertain you on an individual basis. We do have pre-recorded webinars on the general nature of Evolution MX that we can happily forward to you, or we'll entertain it on a one-to-one basis. For those of you who are familiar with Evolution MX already, it's an addition to the core system. It exists within, as I say, the purchase ledger and the subcontractors, and you have two options available with the Invoice Register. Entry level, as I'll refer to it, is whereby you are presented with electronic versions of the invoices that you receive, and you as the operator will make all the conscious decisions as to what to do and where to post it. In addition to that, which I'll come on to at the end, we have the option for OCR, which is a somewhat clever bit where it can read the document that's come in and work out where it's from, who it's from, and what to do with the postings. So we'll be looking at that towards the end of the session. Now, I'm using a dashboard approach here to present me with the information relating to invoices. Dashboards are a feature of Evolution MX generically. I've specifically used them here in the Invoice Register scenario just to give the operator a heads up as to what's expected or what's in progress or what to do in terms of the invoices. So the orange tile in the top left is telling me that I've had 5 items that have come into a designated email address. And that's how the system works. We just need to nominate an email address that is going to be largely, if not exclusively, for invoices received from your suppliers, and maybe a separate one for your subcontractors, although they can both share the same email address. As a result of an email being received to that email address, the attachments will automatically be added to the count so that you can then deal with them individually. Now, if they don't come into the email forwarded onto that, so we're talking about an email address, invoices at your company name, for example, and they can be picked up, as I say, either directly or indirectly. And if you still get hard copies arriving, you can just scan them to that email address. So when I click on my orange tile, I'll be presented with a list of the items that have come in to that email address. They'll be listed in date received order, and you can highlight and see a preview of each of them as they've been received by the system. Now, as I say, it would be useful if this could be exclusively for invoices, but that's always not going to be the case, of course. In the example where I've got here, a statement has come into this email address, I can access the details and just mark it as invalid at the top, just so that it's not going to expect any further processing. But because I might want to deal with it, but just not on this email address, I could use the mail link with inside the document and forward that on to the accounts at email address or your own personal email address, for example, just so that you can deal with it in time, but it's not going to be part of invoice process. So that's an option available to you. And as I say, you can mark it as invalid so that it's no longer going to be expected to have any processing done from an invoice perspective. So here it is now available to me to either send with the other 2 attachments which came in on the same email, or maybe exclude those and then just forward that on to accounts at, or reply to the supplier and say, please don't send documents of this nature to this email address, whatever you choose to do. So if I just mark it as invalid, it'll remove it from my count. So I'm now not expected to do anything. Other bits of housekeeping that you might be interested in is situations whereby an attachment might be received to the invoice register, but it consists of more than one page, and each of those pages might represent individual invoices, or it might be a multi-page invoice. Either scenario can be catered for. So with this particular example at the bottom of the list now, number 33, if I call it up, we can see that it consists of 4 separate pages. And if I browse through the pages, we can see that on page 2, we're going to have a different invoice number represented. So clearly there's been a conjoined set of invoices being received. So what I can do is back to page 1, if I just hit save, it'll give me the option to split. So I can carve it up into the separate items that I could then process individually going forward. What that will do, of course, is it will create me more things to do. So back on my dashboard, the count will be refreshed to reflect there's 6 items now. And when I dive into it, you can see I've got additional items that have been separated out that are now available for processing individually. Okay, within the invoice register, then if I call up the first item here, this could be a straightforward invoice that I'm just going to post to the supplier without involving purchase orders, because it's not dependent on you having purchase orders in the system. I'll come to that in a second. With this one, we've got the invoice displayed for us on the left-hand side, and my input then is on the right-hand side. And remember, this is entry-level invoice register. So I, as the operator, am expected to do all of the input, assisted by an input screen on the right-hand side. So at this point, I can browse for the supplier, either by searching through my entire supplier list, finding them by name, address, postcode, wherever it may be, or just by starting to type. So I can select the supplier from the list that way. The date will always default to today, and of course that's never going to be today, so you can either overtype it or select the calendar to reflect a different date. You'll notice that the period is available to you per posting. For those of you that are familiar with Evolution M, for example, that's not the case, and you have to separate out batches for individual periods. Whereas with the invoice register, you can effectively do an invoice now for June and go back and post a May invoice within the same process, just by specifying a different period for the different invoice. The due date will be worked out by the system based upon the terms that you've set against your supplier. Again, that can be overridden either now or later. I'm not using Evolution M. You'll know that's the barcode number, and we don't involve barcodes at this point, so there's no stickers or scanning involved at this point. So you can leave that field empty. The system will then auto allocate an individual and unique incremental number for you. Ref 2 is where I can put in the supplier's invoice number. And then the value associated will be the gross value. The system makes out the assumptive calculation on VAT. Apologies for those of you in Ireland where the rates are different, but it will obviously pick up on the rate that's set for the specific supplier. If that needs to be changed, you've got the VAT analysis available to you, where you can split it into partial, reduced, or zero rated, or recognition of the alternative rates that you may have. And of course, if there's penny roundings or differences on the calculations, you can override them, the figures that are being shown in the boxes so far. Now, for this particular invoice, I'm not going to involve purchase orders, so I can just go directly to the show cost allocation, where I'll have my analysis breakdown capability. So I can choose at this point how I'm going to analyze that 300 net value. At the bottom, I've got the option of linking it to a contract if I want to. Which in turn will bring up a cost center option for me, or I can post it direct to nominal. So if your overhead invoices, your heat and light and telephone and whatnot, you can bypass the contract and go straight to a selected nominal ledger of your choosing. I'll choose on this occasion, though, to put it against the contract. So similar to the way that we selected the supplier, we can browse on our contracts. We can search for them using any field that you want to. Select the contract. It's defaulting then to the cost head that is set against the supplier. That can be overridden by an alternative, but the default is there to assist you with what is the norm for that particular supplier, but not necessarily always the case. So if it's the full value of the invoice, then I can enter the figure or just accept the 300. If it's less than that, just reduce that figure, and then you'll be left with more lines to analyze. Okay, you can use notes at the bottom if you want to input details about what the value was for. That could just be something that you put in for overhead, maybe. Okay, if you don't like the positioning of what we've got at the bottom of the screen, then you are able to rearrange these fields. So if you're not using purchase orders, for example, you may choose for the notes section to be further over to the left-hand side. And that allows you then to save that as your preferred layout for posting that particular invoice. So if that's all you want to do, that's straight all you need to do at that point. I've got nothing left to allocate, so I can now submit that, and that will go and update the ledger. Okay, so that's a relatively straightforward invoice we can do through that process. If I go back to my to-do list and pick up on another item, item 32, same idea initially, just select the supplier, accept or amend the date that's relevant. Okay, and then you'll be able to put in the reference number. So this time it's invoice number 1238, a gross value including VAT. And this time I'm going to pick up on my purchase orders that I've got sitting against this supplier. So if I browse, I'll get an analytical list of the purchase orders. And what I mean by that is that's a tailorable or configurable list of the purchase orders. So you can design which columns are shown to assist you with the selection and in what order they may be presented. Now I've got 46 outstanding items here for that particular supplier. I can see on the invoice image in the bottom left there, use that as a column filter. Say jump to order number 154. If I call that up, that will now load the lines that I've got set in my system against order number 154. And it may be that you follow a GRN or a goods received process for your purchase orders to record delivery docket details, for example. That's not essential within the system. We just need to understand what you're going to do as the norm. So we can set an option within the system to say either match to delivered lines of a purchase order or look right back to the original purchase order. Your choice as to whether you follow the GRN process or not. If I now show cost allocation, the system will have loaded for me the lines that it recognizes on that purchase order. Okay, showing you and highlighting in yellow, as I've chosen to do so, the relevant quantity and value figures that are going to be used in the calculation. So I'm a bit short on the invoice total here. You can see the to allocate figure is reflecting there's still £53 to be allocated based upon what the purchase order details are that are found. And that could be for a number of reasons. Obviously, if your purchase order matches to your invoice 100%, there'll be nothing more for you to do because that figure to allocate will be 0 and you can just submit that. Your matching is done. The updated status on the purchase order will be confirmed and the supplier details and the contracts and nominals will all be updated. It's only in the situation where I've left myself with deliberately a difference here, just to show you what you can do to iron out those differences. So if we look more closely at the invoice copy here, we can see that we've got a price variance on my second product. 15 is the price on the invoice, 12 was the value on the order. Now it's up to you what you do at this point. You do have the option of at the bottom being able to just double click to change the figure. So you don't have to go back to the purchase order to do so. I'm going to override that figure and it will be reflected in a report. You can get a price variance report of your purchase orders to show you the price that they should have been invoiced and the actual price they were invoiced. So you can highlight any price differences there. So I have reduced the difference somewhat, but it may be that I'm not comfortable with doing that off my own back and I might want to involve somebody else in the process. So what you could do is you could record a note that you want to have and place this on query. So you're involving assistance from somebody else. So whatever you put into the note will appear as the comment section, and then you can select who you're going to pass it to. And the list of selections you get here may or may not be Evolution MX users. I say may or may not. If they are users of Evolution MX, then of course from within Evolution MX, they can approve them in their name. But if they are not an MX user, then simply an email will be sent to them. More useful for people who are more of an ad hoc type user. So as a result of that, it's now actually removed it from my to-do list because I asked that to be a filtered list of those items that I've got no status. I've not posted it, but I can keep an eye on it. Through my dashboard, I've got an alternative tile here. The pale blue tile towards center right there is showing me that I've got 2 items on query. If I click into that, I won't lose track of the items that I've received and sent off to somebody else for their input. And there's item number 32 being shown as being sent to the approver KW. Now, as I say, KW may or may not be a user of the system. Let's assume that he's not for the time being. Through email, then, he could receive something like this that's come in his name with whatever notes you've chosen to put into the invoice entry, and attached to that will be a copy of the invoice. So you can fire that up, all independent of Evolution MX, see the details, see your notes as to what you're referring to, and by replying to that email, it'll come back into the inbox of whoever sent it to him in the first place. So all happening outside of Evolution MX. The purchase ledger clerk can then respond to the answer that's been given on email, maybe go back into the query list. From there, they can say, okay, I've had a response on that particular one, so let me take that off query. I can either now carry on processing it with the findings from the email or just leave it as no longer in query. It'll then be added back to my to-do list. And then when I'm comfortable, I can call it up from there and continue with the work. Okay, so what you'll notice as well is that what the invoice register lets you do is kind of pause and complete an invoice without having to go all the way through and do it all in one go. Those of you that have used Evolution M will know, of course, that's not the case. You've got to go and post the whole thing and then accept it as a posting, or do nothing and abandon out and start the whole process again when you know the full picture. Whereas here, we can say, right, I've done so much of it, but I'm going to come back to it. And as a saved entry, because it's not yet affected in your ledger balances or your contract costs, you can make changes to it, even to the degree of changing the supplier, the date, the period and everything, because nothing's yet been updated through the system. So I'm now going to go back into the show cost allocation. I have the approval to change that price. So I might just make a note on the invoice to say price difference was approved. A sticky notes feature I can just add that somewhere appropriate on the invoice. Okay, but I've still got a little bit of a difference to sort out. I've got 35 quid as a difference. I can see there's charges having been added to the invoice that weren't on the order. So what I'll do there is perhaps ping it back out to somebody else for their approval, or I can, at this point, just choose to add. So rather than having to dive in out of different buttons for order matching and analysis, I'm actually able to add analysis lines to the already displayed purchase order lines. And this could be in the same vein as we saw earlier with the first invoice. So you're able to contract cost it if that's what you want to be able to do, or treat it as an or a combination. So at this point, I'm going to accept that 35 quid is going to be added as an additional line. That now leaves me with nothing left to allocate. So I am free now to submit that, and that would go off and update the ledger, the contract, the nominal and everything. You do have other options. We looked at the query option. What we have in addition to that, or instead of, is we've got something called workflow. Now, with query, what we saw is it sent it off for somebody else's approval, but when that query had been handled, it released it back into your to-do list. And you, as the purchase ledger clerk, saw it again to be able to make any further changes to it. The difference with workflow is it does require approval, usually by an Evolution MX user, but again, not necessarily. They can be dealt with on an email, but it's usually going to be an Evolution MX user. If you select a user at this point, which you're free to do so, then it becomes their responsibility to respond to it. And once they have responded, you'll no longer see it. It'll go off and update the ledger. So it's kind of just a rubber stamp approval rather than dealing with any changes that are likely to be made to the invoice. Now, I am selecting the workflow route here. You do have further options within inside the invoice register to automate that. So you could, for example, automate approval for invoices over 5,000, for example. And we can set certain quite sophisticated rules to work out who needs to be sent the approval and who needs to do what. And it could be multi-level. It could say somebody can do an invoice up to 2,500. Above that, it needs approval. And maybe over a certain level again, it needs to go to a second level approver. So you can build in your required approval routes if you want to. At this point, if I just submit it, because I've involved workflow, it does disappear off my to-do list. It's no longer in my to process count on the dashboard, but it has now been added to what I'm calling submitted. So different from query, that's those that have gone to somebody for their approval. So you can keep an eye on them at that point to see what's happening. Now, the recipient of that could access the system as an approval user. We'll be able to go into that and see that we've got an invoice sitting there for the 400. So I could be able to see it in more detail by clicking onto it. I could now, as an approval user, be able to add further notes to it. So you've got the notes option. Delivery charge, okay, whatever it was. Excuse my spelling mistake at that point. And I have the option of now just saving that. Approving it will then allow me to put any further comments in over and above the yellow sticky note, and that will then approve it and post it off to the ledger. So you're keeping control of it, allowing for the different processes to be followed. The eagle-eyed among you will notice that I am not Tom, even though I sent that to Tom for approval, simply because you have a feature called approval by proxy, which can be set. So if somebody is on holiday or you need to deputise for them for whatever reason, then you can take over their responsibility and handle it either on a permanent or on a temporary basis. Okay, now I did post that through to the ledger. There was still the option within inside the system, if you wanted to be able to put that onto normal hold. By hold, we mean that's going to be on hold within the ledger. So it'll go to the ledger, but it'll be on hold for payment. So you have that option still available to you. Okay, now the subbies side of things works on a very similar basis. So using the subcontractors, I do have an invoicing dashboard for subcontractors. Now I'm choosing to feed off a different email address from a subcontractor invoicing. It's up to you whether you do that or not. It really depends on whose responsibility it is. If it's a different person doing it, it makes sense for it to be a different email address, but it could share the email address. If you're not sharing email addresses, then it already knows that it's a subcontractor invoice. If you were sharing, then you'd have the option of, at the point of selecting the invoice, it will give you a toggle option. So at the top there where it says creditor type subcontractor, you could toggle that between supplier and subcontractor if they were coming in on the same email address. So with subcontractors, as I say, very similar. we're just going to use the selection here to bring up a subcontractor. The order then is requested. So subcontractor ordering is a dependent part of this process. We can call that up, key in the details of the invoice number and the details. Okay, and then if I go to show cost allocation, it will find the order lines that we've got. So this would match with the work categories that you've set on the order for the subcontractor, can be split into labour, material and various other types of breakdown for the different parts of the project. For example, I'm highlighting in yellow the areas or the columns where I can make an entry. So I could be affecting the retention, the discount and so forth, or just putting in a value for a particular element. So we could say here that the 300 that I'm posting is all to do with the labour element. Okay, it gives me a warning. The budget has been exceeded. What that means is that the purchase order value, which you can see there, was only 1,000. We've already gone over that. So it's a continual check against the order value, just to show you that that's the case. You can take any necessary action. But other than that, the process is exactly the same for subcontractors. We've got the same ability for the querying. We've got the same workflow, although of course the workflow routings could be different for subcontractor type invoices. Still got the sticky notes option and so forth. And submitting it from there, in this case, even if you hadn't split it, because I've got a multi-page invoice, it gives you the option to do so now. So in other words, I'm just going to take the single page that's coming through. Okay, so those entries have made their way through onto the various ledgers. Just to show you where they would appear within the purchase ledger, for example, I'd have access to the purchase ledger dashboard, clicking onto one of my tiles. Dashboards are the subject of separate webinars as well, so we can show you how you can construct or make your own versions of the dashboards. Within here, I can go into my supplier breakdown where I can see a couple of invoices have come forward, the ones we just did a few minutes ago. The paperclip is your quick and easy access to those document images. So clicking onto them, you'll be able to see the image and also see those yellow notes that I littered the copy with. And as you hover over a yellow note, it will give you an indication of the date, time and user who made those notes. Okay, so already quite a time-saving option, the invoice register, for helping you with the posting of invoices without the need to print off from email those that are received. If all you're doing that is to create a hard copy that's maybe circulated through the office or used as posting, or with Evolution M users, where you have to put the barcode onto it just to scan it back into the system. Okay, just to finish, I'm going to show you the OCR option, which is available through both subcontractors and suppliers. I'll just use it inside the supplier side of things. It works on the same mechanism, so you'll still be expecting your suppliers and subcontractors to email you in the invoices. The difference will be that you don't need to get as inactive or interactive, I should say, with the posting. So this one has come in from the supplier. It's been sent away for verification by OCR. OCR is just optical character recognition. And it may be that the job has been done and you're satisfied with what it's done and you can just let it post it through to the ledger. I've chosen to use the status here to be verified, because whilst I'm quite happy for the OCR to do its work on the invoice, I still want to have the final say on it. And it's up to you whether that happens or not. So with this particular one, we can just have a look and see what it's done. On the right-hand side, it's pre-populated this based upon the invoice that it's received. And of course, primarily what it's done is it's found your supplier account number. Now, it will have done that by virtue, in this case, of the VAT number. So it's found the VAT number on the invoice, it's checked that against your supplier ledger, and it's found a match. And it said, I'm suggesting that this invoice is for supplier PL001. Now, it may be that you've got a group of companies, for example, where there's more than one that share the VAT number. So it may be at this point you need to override that. That's up to you. But what the system will now be doing is it'll be building up a template as to what an invoice looks like when it comes in from PL001. So it will then know and recognize the positioning, for example, as to where the date is and where the reference number is and where the values are. But you can always override that or interact with it to give it a more real approach to it, I suppose. That's by use of the use for training here. So I'm being guided through the system. And as I click on fields, you'll see where the system thinks the information should have come from. So that was relatively straightforward. The date is the invoice date, but of course, sometimes there are multiple dates on an invoice and you may need to redirect it. The invoice number, for example, rather it came from elsewhere, you just click on the alternative and it now starts to build an alternative picture that it will use for you next time, just by you saying, use that for training. So what I've told you, it needs to be acted upon next time. If it's a one-off change for whatever reason, then not ticking that means the system will allow it this time, but won't take any further notice of it going forward. So you can do that with any of the fields. You can do that also with the values. So the values are being found in the logical area that most invoices would present them down towards the bottom. So you've got that option. It will also find a purchase order number if that has been put in the system and recognized by the system against your outstanding orders. So that in this case, if I go into show cost allocation, just merely to show you what's happened, it's found a match on that purchase order. Therefore, there's nothing left to allocate. The way that the matching works is purely on the purchase order number. So it will make an assumptive 100% match against your purchase orders. It won't look at line by line to work out which lines have been or haven't been. So if you had 4 or 5 lines here and they weren't all covered by the invoice, you would need to adjust them yourself at this point because the system's assuming that the whole thing has been invoiced, which may well be the majority in most cases. So I've got nothing left to allocate at this point. So I can still use the option for sticky notes. I've still got the workflow options, automated or selectable, your choice. But at this point, I can just submit it. And I've had to do far less on that particular invoice to get it affected into the system. Okay, so in a nutshell, that is your invoice register, applicable to both suppliers and subcontractors, with the alternative option for OCR on top to help you further with the automated or suggested automated posting of invoices.